So, this also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. So, what do you think? Should God instantly punish people that violate his laws, or do you think it's a good thing that God waits before he actually punishes people? Appreciate him waiting, okay. Is there a reason you think that God chooses not to punish people instantaneously when they do something wrong? To give them a chance to do better, yeah. Sometimes we learn because we see the effects of our actions on other people. We're thinking, well, I'm the only person I care about, so who cares if this other person gets harmed? But then you actually see the harm that you caused to that person. You say, what I did was wrong. I should not do that. And so you do change. You do become better. In fact, this is found in the New Testament in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. It says that God is patient with us, not wanting any to perish, but for all to come to a knowledge of God. All right, so he's giving us a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance. In fact, there's a verse in here, verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, God gives that person another chance. Now, sometimes if I'm the 100th person that this person has harmed, I sometimes think, I wish God had stopped after 99 and done something about this. But nevertheless, if you're the one that God's forgiving, you're grateful for the chance that he's given you for that. There's also in the book of Isaiah, and let's see, that's before Ezekiel, right? In the book of Isaiah, chapter 26 and verse 10, there's a passage that I wanted to read here. All right, chapter 26, verse 10. Let grace be shown to the wicked. Okay, there's the idea in the Old Testament. We sometimes think, the God of the Old Testament was this unforgiving guy, and anytime you did something, stepped out of line at least a little bit, boom, you were gone. But it says, let grace be shown to the wicked, and then he goes on, yet he will not learn righteousness. All right, so this is God's hope. We show grace, you learn that what you're doing is wrong, and you recover. And he says, he will not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness, he will deal unjustly, and he will not behold the majesty of the Lord. So not everybody is going to come to that point. They're not going to gain faith in Christ. God is willing to give us a chance, but in the end, not everybody's going to come to the truth as people did today. There's several reasons why I'm a Christian. One of the reasons why I'm a Christian is because the Bible answers a lot of the big questions, all of the big questions in life. Now, I separate questions about life into three categories: the past, the present, and the future. The questions that I have about the past is, how do I deal with the guilt, the things that I've done wrong? How do I deal with that guilt? How do I get forgiveness for something that I've done to somebody that I can't tell them that I'm sorry, I can't pay them back for the harm that they did, that I did to them? Maybe they've passed on. There's no way I can do anything for that person to recover from the harm that I did them. And then there's regret. I should have done this. I missed my opportunity to do that. How can I go back, maybe get another chance to do that? Well, that opportunity is past. You missed that. The problem that I have with the present, one of the big questions we have with the present is, what am I doing here? What's the meaning of life? Why am I doing this and not that? What is my ultimate goal in life? What should I be trying to accomplish? And then my problem with the future is there any hope? One of the questions that the author of the book said was, if you knew that you had 40 years to live, would you change what you're doing right now? You got 40 years to live from today's date. How would you change your life? Well, 40 years, I'm 63. I'd be 103. I'd be happy. I don't think I'd change much about my life. Then he says, okay, suppose that you had 5 years to live. The doctor said, you've got this cancer. It's growing slowly, but there's nothing we can do about it. And we know in 5 years, you're out. Okay, Hezekiah, we know what he did when he was told that he only had a short time to live. He prayed to God. And that was actually the third question in the book, which was, what if you knew you had 5 days to live? How would you change your life? What would you do differently if you knew you only had 5 days to live? And that's a closer point. And of course, there's thinking, I really would have to do some things differently than how I'm doing it now. The question, of course, then is, well, why aren't you? Why are you continuing to live your life like this when you don't know whether or not you even have 5 days? There was a country song. By the way, there's always a country song. There's a country song that addresses this, which is titled, live like you were dying. And so this guy found out that he was probably not going to live very much longer. And so he went out and he did some things that he'd never done before. Always wanted to do this, always wanted to do that. So he went about enjoying life as he could under those times and circumstances. And the ultimate answer, of course, is that you should live like that too. Okay. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say that you only have X number of days to live, but there is an ultimate limit, because this is the message in this part of Ecclesiastes, which is that we are all going to die at one point. Skipping over to chapter 9, verse 2, all things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. Whenever the Old Testament, whenever they start doing this, where they give two opposites, the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the people that take oath, the people who don't take an oath, everybody fits into one of those two categories. All right, you're either this or you're that. So it's basically saying everybody. All right, it's just a poetic way of saying everybody. You know, if you just said everybody's going to die, okay, well, that's nice. Well, here's a more poetic way of putting that. And you see, yeah, I'm fit into one of those two categories. A lot of people like to think they're neither righteous nor wicked. I'm sort of lukewarm, which is not good either if you read the book of Revelation. But nevertheless, it is something that's coming to us. And the question that we have to ask about this is whether it's good or bad. Okay, so let's look at chapter 9, let's start in verse 3. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all, death. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. Now, there's symbolism here in these two animals. What did the Jews think about dogs? Did they like dogs? Did they have them for pets or anything? Well, no, the dogs were not thought of as honorable. They were thought of as dishonorable. Goliath, when David comes out to him with his sling and some rocks, Goliath says to him, "Am I a dog that you send a person out here with sticks?" It's like, you're dishonoring me by sending a dog after me. Send a real man out here, somebody that can actually give me a battle. And then in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 30, it talks about the lion being a noble animal, a powerful beast, something that they would honor for the strength of the lion. In fact, Samson, when he saw the dead lion, actually killed a lion, came back later and found the bees making honey in the carcass of the lion. He talked about sweets from the strong. He gets honey from the strong animal that he managed to kill, so he's stronger than the lion. But anyway, lions were thought of as honorable creatures. So when it says, better a living dog than a dead lion, it's saying better to live in shame or dishonor than to die as a noble, well thought of person. Of course, I'd like to live and die as a noble, well thought of person. But there's a question that we have to ask, and we have to ask this because in previous verses, he said the exact opposite. Let's turn back to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Now, this passage here in Ecclesiastes 9 is basically saying it's better to be alive than to be dead. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1. I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On their side, the side of the oppressors is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore, I praised the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. So which one is right? Where did Solomon get it right? Is he right over here when he says that it's better to be dead, or is he right over here where he says it's better to be alive? Well, I think this is not a contradiction. A lot of people point to the Bible and say, well, the Bible contradicts itself, so it can't be true. These two things are exact opposite. They contradict one another. One of them's got to be wrong, so the Bible's basically not a good source to go to. Well, what we're looking at, though, is the fact that Solomon was looking at two different people. Over here, there's a person who's being oppressed in life. There's not a lot of good things in that person's life. And he basically is saying that person would probably be better off dead, not being oppressed, not going through all the suffering that they're going through. But this other person in Ecclesiastes 9, he's talking about enjoying life. And he does encourage people to enjoy their life. If we go back to verse 15 of chapter 8, it says, I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. Where have we heard that phrase before? To eat, drink, and be merry, for this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life which God gives him under the sun. So here's a person who's enjoying life. They should go on living, all right? Even if it does cost them something, basically they're having an enjoyable life. They should continue living. Is there anybody in the Bible that you can think of that had to deal with this question, whether it's better to live or to die? The Apostle Paul actually talked about this question. It was in Philippians chapter 1. He talked about, I've got a question. Should I continue living or should I die? Because for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. There's reasons why it would be better to die to be with Christ than it would be to stay here and suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. There's a point where Paul talks about all the suffering that he went through. You know, the times that he was shipwrecked, the times that he was 40 lashes less one, the times that he was whipped and stoned, apparently to death at least once. He ended up in prison, and finally he was executed by the Romans. And so, you know, he was considering that question, right? Which one is better? He decided that it would be better for the Philippians if he continued living because he could continue providing them with things that they would need. Anybody else after Paul who raised the question of whether it's better to live or die? How about the Old Testament? Saul. Now, Saul made the exact opposite choice because his life ended with him taking his own life. He was in a battle on Mount Gilboa against the Philistines, and this is after basically 40 years reigning as king. He was in his 60s at least at this point. I'm wondering, you know, first of all, he's got to be a strong man because even at 60, he's out there with a sword fighting off his enemies, and he's survived all these other battles he's been through. But in the end, his sons had already been killed, and the Philistines were pressing hard upon him. So he goes to his armor bearer and says, kill me because I'm afraid of what the Philistines will do to me if they catch me alive. Basically, you know, it wasn't nice to get caught by your enemies back then because they would torture you. I mean, it wasn't just, you know, cut off his head and that's it in all cases. In a few cases it was. Agag was king of the Amalekites, and when Samuel basically found he was still alive, he took a sword and cut off his head, so it was over. But a lot of times they would harm people, various punishments and persecutions they would do to the person that they'd caught. And so Saul had evidently heard about what the Philistines did to their enemies, and so he wanted to avoid that. At any rate, he asked his armor bearer to kill him, and the armor bearer was too afraid to do it, so he fell on his own sword. Don't ask me how, but anyway, that's an interesting thing. Anyway, he committed suicide. He decided that for him, life was not worth living, that the question landed on the other side. Anybody in the New Testament that you can think of that decided that the best thing for him to do was to die? Judas Iscariot was another guy that did that. And of course, he was guilty of a great sin of betraying Jesus. Peter also betrayed Jesus. He denied his knowledge of Jesus, and yet Peter decided to continue living. What if Judas had repented? What if Judas had said, you know, I did something wrong? If he had gone to Jesus at any point after that, do you think Jesus would have forgiven him? Right. So it was open to him to do that, but for various reasons, he again chose not to continue living. Anybody else whose name starts with a J? Jesus himself had to ask that question in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's praying to God, says, please let this cup pass from me. He didn't want to die, but nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. This is God's will. This is because we needed this for our salvation, and he was willing to go through that death so that we might obtain salvation. It's not free. It takes blood. It takes a life to cover the sins of all of us. And so Jesus chose for him that it was better for him to die than to go on living. This is a question that people face all the time, and you hear about people making the decision that their life is not worth living. Most of us hang on to life as long as we can. There's a story in Luke chapter 8, verses 43 through 44, of the woman that had the flow of blood. And she had spent all of her resources on doctors trying to be healed from this. Now, at this point, I looked this up a little bit on the internet, and nobody really knows exactly what it was, what this flow of blood was. There's a couple of possibilities, but be aware of the fact that this would make her unclean. So she was unclean because she had this flow of blood and would remain unclean her entire life. Also, there's the idea that her husband, if she was married, the Bible doesn't say if she was married, her husband couldn't have sex with her while she was unclean, all right, with the flow of blood. So if she had been married, she'd probably been divorced, because that would have been a justification, quote unquote. I'm not sure exactly how the Jewish law is on that, but at any rate, she was having a bad life. She spent all of her resources trying to get healed from this, and nobody had been able to give her help. Jesus was walking through a crowd of people, and she was afraid to go up to him and ask him to heal her. But nevertheless, she did reach out and touch the hem of his garment. Now, of course, you're aware of the fact that if an unclean person touches you, they don't become clean, you become unclean. She didn't touch him, she touched his garment. So there's a little bit of difference there, I think. But nevertheless, there's some questions people sometimes raise about that. So she was healed after she'd spent all of her resources trying to stay alive. And this is a question that a lot of people in end-of-life care have to ask. Do I really want to have this much care given, or do I want that much care to be given? Do I really want to spend all of my resources, or since I'm, for various reasons, people will decide one way or the other on that particular question. There are groups in Texas that, of course, are fighting for the hospitals to have to take care of you under those circumstances. And so there are right-to-life groups that are trying to help people out under those particular circumstances that have the questions about whether or not the hospitals have to continue paying for that care. My opinion, of course, is if it's your money, you spend your money the way you want to. But anyway, it's a question that we all have to answer. The Bible gives us several examples of people that face this question and how they dealt with it. For the most part, people that chose death are generally regarded on a lower level than those that chose to continue living. Paul, of course, we think that he was good for making the decision to continue living because he looked at how he could help others. At the same time, we look at Jesus and we praise him for choosing to die because of the help that he provided for others in doing that. There's another example, of course, of people that face the situation of life and death, and that is people that are serving as soldiers, military people working to fight against the enemy, to help to protect this country. And of course, some of those people are going to die as a result of their service for this country. Was it right for them to choose an occupation that they knew might possibly lead to their death? Should they have chosen something safer? Well, if nobody chooses to act in that way, we wouldn't be here in a free country today. So people choose to give their lives to help others. I think it's a good thing. It's generally regarded positively in the Bible. So death comes to all. Therefore, well, how should we live? If I'm going to die anyway, how should we live? Well, let's go back to verse 15. I committed enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life. Eat, drink, and be merry. Where in the New Testament does it talk about eat, drink, and be merry? Okay, that's found in Luke again. Got a lot of references to Luke today for whatever reason, but Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Let's turn over there for just a bit. This is a story. A man comes to Jesus and says, make my brother share the inheritance with me. And Jesus said to him, man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? And he said to them, to the entire group, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what should I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease. Eat, drink, and be merry. And we generally condemn this, but just imagine that you're a Jew, you're hearing Jesus say this for the first time, and you say, that's in Ecclesiastes. Solomon said that. This guy is right when he says, I should just enjoy myself. There was also the idea, of course, that God rendered retribution to people more quickly than we think he does, in the sense that if you're rich, it's because God approves of you. And if you're poor, it's because God disapproves of you. So this rich man is rich because God approves of him, and he's made him wealthy for that reason, just like he did with Job and Abraham. And of course, he should enjoy life. That's what Solomon said to do. Eat, drink, be merry. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy your life. But Jesus turns this around immediately, and they would be surprised over this. God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So there's one point about eat, drink, and be merry. In the Old Testament, it's thought of Ecclesiastes as something that we ought to do. We should enjoy life. We should get as much as we should get what we can out of it. But here, Jesus is saying, you're laying up treasures just for yourself. You're making a mistake. You don't know how much longer you're going to live. Might be 40 years, might be 5 years, might be 5 days. You should live as if you don't know and act as if there's other people in this world that might need your help, and help those that you can. However, Jesus does not completely throw out the idea of enjoying life. If we turn over to, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, we find the parable of the lost son. There's a lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, the prodigal son, it's usually called. And of course, he basically tells his father that you are as good as dead to me, so give me my inheritance now. And then he goes off and wastes it, prodigal, wasteful living. And eventually he comes to his senses and goes back to his father, and the Jews would have been surprised over this again. His father takes him back and is glad that his son is returned. And his older son, who has always done what his father told him to do, always obeyed his father, is upset at this. How can you do this? Your son basically said he wished you were dead. He left and wasted all your resources, and now you bring him in and you kill the fatted calf for him. And so verse 31 says, son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad. It was right. For your brother was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. Now, the parable here isn't actually about a father and a son on earth that actually go through this. It's talking about us and God. And it's actually after the Pharisees had complained to Jesus about, why are you going after these sinners? They're lost. You shouldn't care about them. Well, God cares about the lost. God cares about the sinners. Here's an example of how this really works. And you Pharisees, you're like this older son, that you don't want these guys back. You think that they've lost their chance, sort of thing. So let's just give up on them. But no, we should be merry. We should be glad when a sinner repents and turns to God. Whether or not they've always been a Christian or they suddenly became a Christian in old age, that's still something over which we should rejoice. So eat, drink, and be merry in life, but take concern for other people into account. Verse 9 of chapter 9, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. There's that word again. Vain here will say short. Your short life, 60, 70, 80 years, still pretty short, which he has given you under the sun all your days of vanity. For that is your portion in life and in the labor in which you perform under the sun. So there's, live joyfully, eat, drink, and be merry. Enjoy what God has given you. Going back up to verse 7, go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, clean. Let your head lack no oil. Oil was ointment and thought to be a good thing. When you wanted to tell someone that they were going to be king, you went and anointed them with oil. Right? That's what Samuel did when he told Saul that he was going to be king. And eventually he anointed David to be the successor for him. Has God already accepted your works? Well, it depends upon your works are. Later we'll find there's a verse that says that God is going to bring all of our works into judgment. So do what you think best, but take God into account in determining what you think best. Pleasing God is is what we should do. That's next week, so we'll get into that later. But one more thing, verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. Do it with all your might. Well, that's in the New Testament also. That's Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, where he's actually giving advice to bond servants, but he says, do what you have to do. Do your work as well as you can. All right, so that's brought out in the New Testament as well. Sometimes I think the people that wrote the New Testament must have read the Old Testament too, because there's so many references. If you look, there's a lot of references to things in here that you find in the New Testament. It's not just new stuff that, well, we might not have ever heard of it before because we might not have read the Old Testament, but it's in there, and you just have to look. Okay, let me skip ahead. Let's see. Chapter 9, verse 11. Chapter 9, verse 11 starts off talking about how things don't always go the way that we think they would. In this life, unfair things happen. Good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Okay, so time and chance is the reason why why bad things happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people, because we do our best, we try, we make our plans to do this or to do that. In the New Testament, we're told if God wills, then we will do this or that. But we make our plans, we make our choices, and nevertheless, no matter how well we plan, we don't always get the result that we wanted to have. We practice and we train and we do as well as we can. We learn to run and we trip, and somebody else wins the race. We were faster than that person. We know we could have beaten them, but something happens that's just out of the blue. There's a lot of cases where things just happen and things don't turn out the way that we want. The tortoise wins the race over the hare. Right? We've had that parable in our history for a long time, that because of the foolishness of the hare, thinking that he's going to win, he rests and lays off, and the tortoise ends up winning the race. So the same thing. It's not always men of skill that are going to be honored by society. It's not always the fastest that wins. I would, of course, point out, it says the race is not to the swift. Let's put the word always. It's not always to the swift. Generally, those that prepare best, the swiftest runner is the one that's going to win. Generally speaking, the battle does go to the strong. Right? Now, God can change things the way he wants to. He mentions that if you do what I want you to do, then what you'll find is one of you will cause 10 to flee, and 10 of you will cause 1,000 to flee. So there are cases where the weaker side does win. God brings that about. But generally speaking, if you got more soldiers, you're going to win the battle. There are certain places where you can only get a certain number of people into the battle at one time. In that case, you still might lose. But historically, there was some battle of Thermopylae where the Persians had this huge number of people advantage over the Greeks, and the Greeks won the battle because it was a place that was a narrow place where they couldn't get all the Persians in the battle at one time. So they had to fight one-on-one, sort of, and the Greeks ended up winning that. We continue on in here, and starting in verse 11, there's a famous phrase here, cast your bread upon the waters. Cast your bread upon the waters. Now, if somebody's got the New International Version, please read that for me. Chapter 11, Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 1. You got that? I want the New International Version. Okay.
Ship your grain across the sea, and many days you may receive a return.
Okay, so he's talking about gaining a profit by engaging in overseas commerce. Engage in trade with the people. Here's these people over here. Ship your grain overseas, sell it to those people, and eventually the money will come back, and you'll make a big profit off of that. I've read a number of stories that talk about the idea that there's these rich people, they had a ship and they sent it off and it never comes back, so now they lost all their resources and they're poor for the rest of their lives, and that sort of thing happens also. It's a risk if you put all your eggs in one basket. Some other people view this as an encouragement to help people out. Cast your bread upon the water, so you help these people out, you help those people out. Verse 2 also says, give a serving to 7 and also to 8, so help people out in life. And it says, you do not know what evil will be on the earth. You don't know whether or not there's going to be a time when you're going to be the person that needs the help. All right. You've planned, you've made your choices, you've made your decisions, you've gotten a good education, you've got a good job, and you've made all the right decisions, and nevertheless something happens and you're the one that needs help. So you help people out while you can. Hopefully, in the end, if you ever need that help, there will be people that will help you out as well. There's a passage in the New Testament where Jesus talks about the unjust steward, another parable that he tells. Here's this guy that's been told by his master, you can no longer be steward over my goods. So get your accounts ready and let me see the final balance here before you leave. And the guy says, I'm too weak to dig ditches and I'm too proud to beg. What can I do? Here's what I'll do. I'll go to my creditors, my boss's creditors, and I will change their bills so that they will welcome me into their house when I'm kicked out of this one. All right, so that's basically what Ecclesiastes is saying here. If you help people out, in the end, they will feel grateful and help you out when you're in need. All right, so there's something about caring for others in your life and not just saying, well, I've got all this money for me. Why should I share it with anybody else? All right. Now, another thing that we have a problem with in this chapter is in life, I should say, and I'm going to end here in just a minute. We have a problem in life in making decisions to actually do something. There are people that wait for the right sign to take place before they do something. Okay, how will I know that it's right to do something? Because time and chance happens to everybody, but there's signs from the gods that tell me this is when I should do this and this is when I should do that. So I go to my horoscope person and they say, well, now is a good time for you to engage in this type of activities. Now is a time when you don't want to engage in this type of activity. We look for signs before we do things because we think that this will make us more likely to be successful. In farming, you wait for the full moon to plant, or you wait for this before you plant this crop, you wait for this to happen before you plant that crop, before you harvest, and so people look for signs, but basically he says in verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. All right, so we have to wait for certain things because sometimes you harvest your crop and you leave it out in the field to dry before you take it into your barn, but if it's going to rain, you don't want to harvest right at that point, for you look for the clouds and say, okay, there's no clouds up there, so it's not going to rain for the next week. Maybe. All right, you're looking for that sign. So you might not ever reap because you're waiting for the right moment and it never comes. I was reading in the book of Jeremiah, and the book of Jeremiah has a point about this, and this is in, Jeremiah chapter 46. And I got to tell you, I'm reading a different version of the Bible. I try to get different versions out and read them from time to time. So I'm reading the Good News translation right now. But let me read you Jeremiah 46, verse 17. It says in the New King James, they cried there, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is but a noise. He has passed by the appointed time. Okay, the Good News translation says, give the king of Egypt a new name, noisy braggart who missed his chance. I like that version. I really like the way they put that. I can't say that they translated that literally, but it does say he was a noise, and it does say he missed his opportunity. We miss our opportunity. Egypt, the king of Egypt, missed his opportunity to accomplish something. He waited too long, and the opportunity passed him by. We have opportunities to do things, and if we're looking for the right sign, it's going to pass us by. So sometimes we just have to take a risk. Cast your bread upon many waters. Invest in lots of different things. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, but don't do nothing. All right? Figure out something to do and do your best at it. Life is short. We have to do what we can in the limited time we have available to us. I'm going to stop there. The last few verses of chapter 11 actually go along a lot with what's in chapter 12. All right, so it's starting to talk about the end of life and what the meaning of life is. I said the Bible answers those big questions. That's one of the reasons why I'm a Christian, is because it does give good answers for those questions. So we're going to see what the meaning of life is and how we should live our life, therefore. All right, any questions? All right, I appreciate your attendance, and we'll have a closing prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Our Lord, we thank you for all your many wonderful blessings. Thank you for the opportunity you give us to learn from your word. Help us as we're studying through the book of Ecclesiastes to take what we learned here and help us to make better decisions about how to live our life and to move ahead as we practice to serve you. For these things we pray in Christ's name.